At the heart of Stoic philosophy lies the pursuit of tranquility through the mastery of what is within one's control and the acceptance of what is not. Stoics like Epictetus emphasized the importance of distinguishing between these two realms, advocating that emotional suffering arises when individuals cling to things beyond their control, relationships, outcomes, and external circumstances. The key to peace, from a Stoic perspective, is to let go of desires tied to the uncontrollable and focus instead on cultivating rationality and detachment. However, for women, the Stoic teachings on control and detachment often clash with their natural tendency toward emotional attachment. Women are typically more invested in relationships, emotional bonds, and outcomes, leading to greater difficulty in letting go of things they perceive as significant but uncontrollable. Whether through relationships, personal aspirations, or societal expectations, women tend to form deep attachments to aspects of life that Stoicism encourages them to release. This creates a unique struggle for women, as their emotional nature and cultural conditioning often reinforce the importance of maintaining control over what they deeply care about. The Stoic call to accept the impermanence of such things and practice detachment often feels at odds with women's lived experiences, making the application of Stoic principles far more challenging. Understanding this tension between Stoic detachment and women's emotional attachment provides key insights into the complexities of their pursuit of peace and emotional resilience. Number 1. The Stoic acceptance of impermanence and its impact on women's emotional attachment. At the heart of Stoic philosophy is the principle of acceptance of impermanence, understanding that nothing in life is permanent and that all external circumstances, including relationships, are subject to change. The Stoic mindset encourages individuals to detach from desires, attachments, and the outcomes of life, focusing instead on what is within their control. By doing so, Stoics aim to achieve peace of mind and freedom from the emotional turbulence that arises from the transitory nature of life. However, for women, this concept of impermanence can have a more profound emotional impact. Women tend to be more emotionally attuned and invested in their relationships, which can make the awareness of impermanence particularly difficult to reconcile. The Stoic ideal of detachment from external circumstances may be intellectually grasped, but emotionally, women often find it much harder to fully accept. Women are often biologically and socially inclined to nurture and form deep emotional bonds with others. These bonds are not merely intellectual, but deeply rooted in their sense of identity and well-being. In contrast, Stoicism, with its emphasis on reason and logic over emotion, teaches that all attachments, whether to people, desires, or outcomes, should be released to avoid suffering. However, this separation of reason from emotion does not always align with the natural inclinations of women. Women are often more prone to experience emotional attachment and dependency, particularly when it comes to relationships. This is not necessarily seen as a weakness, but rather a part of their intrinsic nature to seek connection and intimacy. When relationships end, whether through separation, distance, or loss, women are often more deeply affected because their sense of emotional investment is stronger. From a Stoic perspective, such attachments are viewed as sources of suffering because they are viewed as outside one's control. The Stoic response is to practice equanimity by accepting the impermanence of relationships and focusing on what remains within one's power, namely one's own inner state. However, for women, this detachment is often easier said than done. Emotional resilience, which is a fundamental part of women's experience, can exacerbate the pain of loss, making it harder to let go of relationships or connections. Women may intellectually understand Stoic teachings regarding the transient nature of life, Yet their emotional connection to relationships makes it difficult to implement this understanding in practice. The attachment that women form to others goes beyond surface-level connections. It is often tied to a deep sense of security, identity, and a longing for intimacy. This emotional depth makes it harder to adopt the Stoic view of detachment, as women may feel that letting go of these connections undermines their sense of self. Additionally, cultural and societal expectations often reinforce the idea that women should prioritize relationships, making them more prone to valuing emotional bonds over Stoic ideals of self-reliance and detachment. Women may internalize these expectations, further intensifying their emotional reactions to the loss of relationships. From a Stoic perspective, this emotional response is seen as a byproduct of failing to accept reality as it is. The practice of Stoicism encourages individuals to adopt a mindset where they recognize that all things, relationships, emotions, and even identity, are transient. By detaching from these attachments, one can avoid unnecessary suffering. However, the emotional nature of women, characterized by vulnerability, empathy, and connection, often conflicts with this detached approach. Women may feel more deeply when a relationship ends because their sense of identity is tied to the bonds they form. This emotional attachment makes it harder to let go, even when they understand, at a cognitive level, the Stoic teachings on impermanence. Moreover, the Stoic principle of controlling one's reactions and accepting what is beyond one's control might seem plausible in theory, but it can feel unnatural when applied to deeply rooted emotional experiences. For women, the loss of relationships may trigger feelings of inadequacy or worthlessness, not because they fail to understand the philosophy, but because their emotional framework is not easily reconciled with the Stoic ideals of detachment. In this context, women may find it more challenging to find peace when they encounter loss, especially since they are more inclined to seek security and stability through their relationships. Ultimately, the Stoic acceptance of impermanence does provide a pathway to reducing emotional suffering. However, for women, the emotional attachments formed through relationships often create a deeper and more persistent sense of loss, even when they understand the theoretical framework of Stoicism. The struggle between their emotional nature and the Stoic ideal of detachment reflects a profound tension between feelings and reason, requiring women to adapt Stoic principles in ways that honor their emotional complexity. Number 2. Women's emotional resilience versus Stoic detachment. The struggle between feelings and reason. At the heart of Stoic philosophy lies the belief that true peace and tranquility come from focusing on what is within one's control and accepting what is not. Stoics emphasize the importance of detachment from external circumstances, relationships, and desires that cannot be controlled. The central, "some things are up to us and some things are not," calls for individuals to detach from outcomes, trust reason over emotion, and cultivate a mindset of acceptance. However, for women, this Stoic emphasis on detachment and reason often stands in direct opposition to their natural tendency toward emotional resilience and the importance they place on relationships and connection. Women are generally more emotionally invested in their relationships, and their sense of identity is often tied to these emotional investment, makes the Stoic practice of detachment, especially when it comes to letting go of uncontrollable outcomes or relationships, a difficult and sometimes conflicting pursuit. The Stoic approach to emotional regulation encourages individuals to accept the impermanence of relationships, focusing on what can be controlled, such as one's thoughts and responses. For women, however, these emotional bonds are deeply integrated into their sense of self and well-being. Their emotional resilience tends to make them more attuned to the emotional aspects of relationships, often seeking connection trust, and security in ways that go beyond Stoic reasoning. The conflict arises because while Stoicism, that emotional detachment is necessary to avoid suffering, women's emotional resilience tends to draw them toward the very things Stoicism encourages them to let go of. When relationships end, trust as circumstances change, women may experience emotional distress precisely because they have invested deeply in these connections. From a Stoic perspective, these attachments to external circumstances are unnecessary and lead to unnecessary suffering. The Stoic ideal of emotional detachment seeks to liberate individuals from the pain caused by such attachments by emphasizing rational acceptance of what is beyond one's control. However, women's emotional resilience often makes it difficult for them to adopt this Stoic mindset. Their tendency to invest emotionally in relationships is a fundamental part of their experience, making it challenging to shift toward a more detached, reason-driven approach. Stoicism asks individuals to detach from things like outcomes, relationships, and personal desires, recognizing them as beyond their control. However, for women, the emotional significance of these aspects often feels unavoidable. Their emotional responses are not easily overridden by reason, particularly when relationships or trust are at stake. For example, when a woman's sense of security is disrupted by the end of a relationship or the betrayal of trust, the emotional turmoil can be intense. This emotional resilience is not necessarily a sign of weakness, but rather a fundamental aspect of women's experience that differs from the more rational and detached approach typically associated with Stoicism. Women's emotional attachment to relationships often leads them to seek security, connection, and meaning in ways that can conflict with the Stoic practice of accepting impermanence and focusing on what is within one's control. The emphasis on reason and detachment promoted by Stoicism tends to prioritize logical thinking over emotional responses. However, for women, emotional responses are often deeply intertwined with their sense of self and identity, making it harder for them to adopt a purely detached perspective. In contrast, Stoicism encourages individuals to rise above emotional reactions and accept that relationships, outcomes, and external circumstances are beyond their control. While this may lead to a sense of peace for some, women's emotional resilience and their cultural conditioning often reinforce the importance of these attachments. Emotional bonds tend to be central to women's sense of security and well-being, and their natural inclination toward connection makes it difficult to simply let go of relationships or trust when they are lost. Stoicism, with its focus on rationality and detachment, may seem to disregard the emotional depth that women often experience in these situations. Women tend to seek not only emotional intimacy, but also a sense of purpose and identity through their relationships. The idea that relationships, once lost, are simply to be accepted as impermanent feels inadequate to many women, who may view these bonds as integral to their emotional well-being. The Stoic teaching to accept what is beyond one's control may, for many women, feel like an oversimplification that fails to account for the emotional complexity of relationships. The emotional resilience women possess often intensifies their struggle with detachment, as they tend to view relationships as more than just external circumstances to be relinquished. They may feel that detachment from these bonds represents a loss of identity, security, or purpose, leading to a sense of emotional emptiness. In contrast, Stoicism emphasizes that suffering arises from our attachment to external factors, and that emotional distress is reduced by accepting what is beyond our control. Yet, for women, this acceptance is not always easily achievable because their emotional bonds are closely tied to their sense of self. The conflict between emotional resilience and Stoic detachment becomes particularly pronounced when women experience the end of a relationship, betrayal of trust, or the loss of an important connection. In such situations, their emotional investment makes it difficult to adopt the Stoic mindset of rational acceptance and detachment. Women often experience profound emotional suffering when these attachments are disrupted, because these bonds are not merely external circumstances, but sources of their identity, security, and emotional well-being. The Stoic approach encourages focusing on internal control, one's thoughts, actions, and reactions, while letting go of desires tied to external circumstances. However, women's emotional resilience often leads them to view these external factors as essential to their sense of self. When women are unable to control or maintain the relationships they value, they may experience significant emotional distress, as the attachment to these relationships is deeply ingrained. From a Stoic perspective, the solution lies in shifting focus from the uncontrollable to what can be controlled. However, women's emotional resilience often makes this shift difficult, as their sense of connection and emotional bonds are central to their identity and well-being. The struggle between reason and emotion, highlighted by the contrast between Stoic detachment and women's emotional resilience, emphasizes the need to find a balance that respects both rational and emotional realities. While Stoicism offers a framework for managing emotions through detachment, women's lived experiences often challenge the applicability of this philosophy in emotional situations where connection and identity are closely intertwined. Number 3. The role of vulnerability and trust in women's deep emotional bonds. Vulnerability and trust are central to women's deep emotional bonds, playing a crucial role in their relationships and overall sense of well-being. For women, emotional connections are often built on the foundation of trust and vulnerability, which contribute to a sense of security, intimacy, and belonging. These bonds are not merely about closeness, they are fundamental to women's identity, emotional resilience, and how they navigate the world. Vulnerability in this context refers to the willingness to open oneself up to emotional risk, sharing fears, desires, and uncertainties, and trust refers to the belief that one's emotional needs will be acknowledged, respected, and honored. In women's lives, these components are inextricably linked. Vulnerability allows women to express their authentic selves, and trust ensures that they feel safe in doing so. The combination of these two elements fosters deeper emotional bonds, but also creates a greater reliance on those relationships for emotional security. From a Stoic perspective, vulnerability and trust might seem counterproductive, as Stoicism emphasizes rationality and detachment from external circumstances. The Stoic ideal promotes the notion that emotional suffering stems from attachment to things beyond our control. For women, however, emotional bonds that are built on vulnerability and trust are not mere external circumstances, but integral aspects of their sense of self. When these bonds are weakened or lost, women often experience profound emotional distress. The Stoic practice of detachment may advocate for accepting impermanence and letting go of such attachments, but for women, this is often easier said than done. Vulnerability is particularly significant in women's emotional bonds because it requires an openness to emotional exposure. Women tend to invest deeply in relationships where trust is present, often seeking connection and intimacy that extends beyond surface-level interactions. Trust creates a sense of security, allowing women to feel comfortable in expressing their vulnerabilities without fear of judgment or rejection. In many ways, vulnerability allows women to establish emotional intimacy, fostering a sense of connection that is vital to their well-being. When these bonds are disrupted, whether through betrayal, loss, or misunderstandings, the emotional impact can be profound. The loss of trust or vulnerability in relationships leaves women feeling disconnected and insecure, leading to feelings of isolation, sadness, and uncertainty. This is particularly true in romantic relationships, but can extend to friendships, familial connections, and professional relationships as well. Trust is a critical component of these bonds because it establishes a foundation of reliability and support. For women, trusting others often involves an internal process of assessing whether they can feel safe in exposing their authentic selves. When trust is broken, whether through betrayal, abandonment, or dishonesty, it becomes difficult for women to rebuild these connections. Vulnerability and trust work together to reinforce women's emotional bonds. Vulnerability invites women to show their true selves, while trust ensures that those vulnerabilities will be respected and honored. However, the Stoic focus on rational detachment and the acceptance of impermanence may conflict with the emotional resilience women seek from their relationships. Stoicism teaches that suffering is often a result of attachments to things beyond one's control, attachments like relationships and trust. From this perspective, the Stoic response would be to let go of these attachments, acknowledging that they are fleeting and ultimately outside of one's control. Yet for women, the loss of trust and vulnerability in relationships often feels like a loss of a fundamental part of themselves. The Stoic approach, which encourages detachment from external circumstances, may seem overly simplistic when applied to women's lived experiences of emotional vulnerability. In practice, women's emotional bonds are shaped by their need for connection, security, and a sense of belonging. These needs are met through relationships built on trust and vulnerability. When these bonds are disrupted, the emotional fallout is often more intense for women, as their sense of self is closely tied to these relationships. The Stoic ideal of detachment asks individuals to accept the impermanence of such bonds, reducing suffering by focusing on what can be controlled: our thoughts, actions, and responses. However, for women, emotional bonds tied to vulnerability and trust are not merely external circumstances to be let go of. They are deeply connected to their sense of identity. Women often derive emotional strength from these connections, making it difficult to adopt a purely Stoic mindset of acceptance and detachment. The Stoic practice, which emphasizes reason and detachment from things beyond control, may overlook the emotional complexity that women experience in their relationships. Vulnerability requires women to acknowledge their fears, uncertainties, and emotional needs, which are often met through trust and security. When trust is lost, women may experience emotional disconnection and a profound sense of instability, as these bonds were integral to their emotional resilience. The Stoic approach, which seeks to free individuals from suffering by letting go of desires tied to external circumstances, fails to fully address the emotional depth of women's attachment to relationships based on trust and vulnerability. Trust in relationships also plays a significant role in how women perceive their self-worth. For many women, their emotional well-being is deeply tied to their ability to form secure bonds with others. When trust is broken, women often struggle to rebuild those connections, leading to feelings of uncertainty, fear, and isolation. The Stoic detachment from these attachments may seem appealing from a rational perspective. But for women, the emotional cost of letting go of these bonds is often too great. Trust and vulnerability create a sense of safety that allows women to navigate their emotional lives with confidence. When this safety is threatened or lost, the emotional impact can be overwhelming. For women, relationships grounded in trust and vulnerability are often not only sources of emotional connection, but also integral components of their identity. The Stoic philosophy encourages individuals to focus on what is within their control, namely their thoughts, actions, and responses, and to let go of attachments to external circumstances. However, for women, these external circumstances such as relationships and trust, are not easily discarded because they form the foundation of their emotional resilience. When trust is lost or weakened, women often experience a sense of disconnection and emotional turmoil, as these relationships were central to their self-perception and emotional well-being. The struggle between Stoic detachment and women's emotional bonds, built on trust and vulnerability, highlights the complexities of managing emotions and relationships. While Stoicism offers a framework for cultivating peace through rational detachment, women's lived experiences often challenge the applicability of these teachings in emotional situations. Ultimately, the role of vulnerability and trust in women's deep emotional bonds underscores the difficulty of applying Stoic philosophy in ways that respect both their emotional resilience and their pursuit of peace. Number 4. Stoicism and women. Letting go versus holding on. Stoicism, with its emphasis on rationality, detachment, and acceptance of what is beyond one's control, presents a philosophical framework that often contrasts with the deeply emotional and relational experiences of women. At the core of Stoic thought lies the idea that suffering arises from our attachments to things we cannot control, relationships, desires, outcomes, while peace is achieved by letting go of these attachments and focusing on what lies within our control. From a Stoic perspective, letting go of such attachments is essential for achieving tranquility and reducing emotional suffering. However, for women, the struggle between letting go and holding on is far more complex. Women tend to place a significant emphasis on connection, relationships, and the emotional bonds they form. These bonds, whether in the context of family, friendships, or romantic partnerships, are often central to women's sense of identity and well-being. The tension between the Stoic call to detach from attachments and women's emotional resilience creates a unique struggle, as their emotional bonds are not merely external circumstances, but integral aspects of their self-worth. Letting go, as encouraged by Stoicism, is often perceived as a necessary step toward peace. However, for women, the act of letting go is often accompanied by significant emotional distress, especially when relationships or trust are at stake. Women are often more emotionally invested in relationships, and their sense of security tends to be closely tied to these connections. From a Stoic perspective, this attachment to relationships is a source of unnecessary suffering. The Stoic philosophy advocates for the acceptance of impermanence and the idea that external circumstances, such as relationships, are not within our control. Therefore, letting go of these attachments is seen as a rational response to the inevitable losses and changes in life. Yet for women, the emotional weight tied to these relationships makes the process of letting go far more difficult. Emotional bonds, particularly those built on trust and vulnerability, are foundational to women's sense of self. When these bonds are disrupted, women often experience profound emotional distress. The Stoic ideal of accepting what is beyond one's control might provide some relief for those who can adopt a purely rational mindset, but for many women, this detachment feels unnatural and insufficient. Letting go, from a Stoic perspective, is viewed as a rational acceptance of the impermanence of relationships and the acknowledgement that we cannot control external circumstances. However, for women, holding on to these bonds may feel essential for their emotional resilience and well-being. Women often derive a sense of meaning, purpose, and security from their relationships. Letting go of these bonds may seem to require a sacrifice of these emotional foundations. The tension between letting go and holding on is especially visible when relationships come to an end, whether through betrayal, loss, or change. For women, the emotional attachment to relationships is not simply about avoiding suffering, but about maintaining a sense of identity, connection, and emotional stability. The Stoic emphasis on letting go may feel abstract when applied to these deeply personal and meaningful connections. While Stoicism seeks to reduce suffering by focusing on what lies within one's control, primarily our thoughts, actions, and responses, women's emotional bonds are not so easily separated from their sense of self. Holding on to these relationships may represent a deep desire for security, belonging, and purpose, even as the Stoic framework suggests that such attachments are ultimately futile. In practice, many women may struggle to adopt the Stoic mindset of letting go, especially when emotional bonds are threatened or lost. The emotional distress that often accompanies such situations may feel counterproductive to the Stoic pursuit of tranquility. While Stoicism promotes rational detachment, women's emotional resilience often keeps them attached to relationships, especially those built on trust and vulnerability. The conflict between letting go and holding on is rooted in the differing ways that men and women tend to experience relationships and emotional bonds. For women, relationships are often central to their sense of self-worth and emotional well-being. This is in contrast to the Stoic emphasis on self-sufficiency and detachment from external circumstances. The Stoic philosophy encourages acceptance of what is beyond our control, including relationships, suggesting that emotional suffering arises from our attachment to things that cannot be controlled. Letting go, in this context, is viewed as a rational response to this suffering. Yet, for women, letting go often feels like an unnatural and difficult process, especially when the bonds are deeply embedded in their emotional landscape. The experience of holding on to relationships may feel essential to women's sense of identity, purpose, and security. In contrast, the Stoic call to let go may appear to them as an oversimplification of the emotional depth that relationships hold. Women's emotional resilience, particularly in the face of loss, may heighten their attachment to relationships that have shaped their sense of self. When these relationships are threatened or end, women often struggle to accept the idea of letting go, as they may perceive these connections as fundamental to their well-being. The Stoic perspective, which values rationality and detachment, may overlook the emotional complexity that women experience when they try to reconcile their desire for connection with the need to accept impermanence. Letting go, for women, may represent not only the loss of the relationship itself, but also the loss of the emotional foundation that supported their sense of self. In contrast, holding on may feel like an attempt to preserve these foundational elements, even when they become unattainable. For many women, the act of holding on to relationships is driven by a desire for emotional stability and security, both of which are deeply connected to their sense of identity. The Stoic practice of detachment, while offering a framework for reducing suffering, may seem to neglect the emotional significance of these connections for women. The struggle between letting go and holding on is not simply about external circumstances. It is about how women experience their emotional bonds and the meaning they derive from them. From a Stoic standpoint, letting go is framed as a rational acceptance of the impermanence of relationships, reducing emotional suffering by focusing on what is within one's control. However, for women, this process is often emotionally fraught. Letting go of relationships and trust, foundations of vulnerability, can feel like letting go of a part of themselves. Emotional bonds that are tied to vulnerability, trust, and connection often define women's sense of self, making it difficult for them to adopt a purely detached Stoic mindset. Holding on, for many women, may feel like an effort to preserve the emotional depth that these bonds provide. The challenge for women lies in reconciling their emotional attachment to relationships with the Stoic ideal of detachment from what is beyond their control. Letting go from this perspective may seem like a necessary step toward peace, but it is rarely as simple or straightforward as the Stoic philosophy suggests. Instead, women may find that holding on to these bonds feels essential to their emotional resilience and well-being. The tension between letting go and holding on underscores the complexity of women's emotional experiences as they strive to balance their attachment to relationships with the Stoic pursuit of rational detachment. Number 5. The Stoic understanding of control and women's attachment to the uncontrollable. At the core of Stoic philosophy is the principle of focusing on what is within one's control and accepting what is not. Epictetus, one of Stoicism's most prominent figures, famously stated, "Some things are within our control and some things are not." For Stoics, the key to emotional tranquility lies in differentiating between these two realms, accepting what we cannot change and taking responsibility for what we can. This Stoic mindset seeks to cultivate a sense of peace by eliminating attachment to external circumstances and outcomes that are beyond one's control. However, for women, the Stoic understanding of control and detachment presents unique challenges, particularly due to their emotional nature and their tendency to form strong attachments to aspects of life that are often perceived as uncontrollable. Women are often biologically wired to seek connection, security, and emotional intimacy. These needs are deeply embedded in their sense of identity and well-being, which often makes their emotional bonds more profound. Whether through relationships, personal goals, or external circumstances, women tend to experience greater attachment to things that fall outside their control. This attachment stands in stark contrast to the Stoic philosophy, which emphasizes the importance of recognizing what is beyond one's influence and letting go of desires tied to those things. The Stoic ideal of controlling only what is within one's power suggests that emotional suffering arises from placing too much importance on things that are outside our control. By acknowledging the limits of their power, Stoics aim to reduce the turmoil that comes from futile desires and attachments. However, women, often shaped by cultural and emotional tendencies, tend to hold on to relationships, expectations, and outcomes that they perceive as significant, despite the Stoic teachings that encourage them to let go. Emotional attachment for women often goes beyond the intellectual understanding of control. While Stoicism advocates that things like relationships, personal achievements, and even the behaviors of others are largely outside of our control, women tend to be emotionally invested in these aspects. For example, women may feel a strong attachment to relationships, particularly those involving trust and emotional intimacy. These bonds are often central to their sense of identity and security. When relationships end or are disrupted, women may experience emotional distress precisely because these connections were perceived as uncontrollable, yet deeply meaningful. In contrast, the Stoic approach urges individuals to accept that external circumstances such as relationships, outcomes, or others' behaviors cannot be controlled, and thus should not cause emotional turmoil. However, this acceptance is often easier said than done, particularly for women who may find it difficult to apply Stoic principles to their emotional lives. For women, the desire for control often takes the form of managing relationships, securing emotional bonds, and maintaining a sense of security through connection. When these elements are perceived as threatened or lost, the emotional impact can be significant. The Stoic emphasis on relinquishing attachment to these uncontrollable aspects conflicts with this deep-rooted desire to maintain control over relationships, feelings, and outcomes. Women's attachment to the uncontrollable stems not only from emotional vulnerability, but also from societal expectations. Cultural norms often reinforce the idea that women are naturally inclined toward caregiving, nurturing, and maintaining emotional bonds. These expectations further strengthen their attachment to things that may be outside their control, such as the behavior of others or the outcomes of their relationships. As a result, when these uncontrollable aspects are disrupted or lost, women are more likely to experience emotional distress. In contrast, men may be more inclined to rely on rational detachment, distancing themselves from outcomes that fall outside their control. This difference in emotional resilience stems from varying social and biological factors. Stoicism, while offering a framework for managing emotions through detachment, does not always account for the emotional complexities of women. The Stoic practice of accepting what is beyond control requires a level of emotional fortitude that women may find more difficult to achieve due to their heightened attachment to relationships and emotional bonds. Women's emotional resilience, while valuable, often amplifies their struggles with accepting uncontrollable circumstances. The Stoic understanding of control emphasizes that freedom from suffering lies in recognizing the limits of control and detaching from desires tied to external outcomes. Yet for women, the attachment to these uncontrollable aspects, particularly relationships, often feels deeply personal and integral to their sense of self. As such, the struggle between Stoic detachment and women's emotional attachment highlights the tension between reason and emotion. Ultimately, while Stoicism offers a path to emotional tranquility through acceptance of what is beyond control, women's emotional bonds often reflect a deeper attachment to these uncontrollable aspects, making the practice of Stoic detachment more challenging. In conclusion, the Stoic understanding of control, focusing on what is within one's power and accepting the uncontrollable, clashes with women's natural tendencies toward emotional attachment and connection. Women are often socially and biologically inclined to seek intimacy, security, and emotional bonds, which are deeply tied to their sense of identity and well-being. As a result, the Stoic ideal of detachment from these uncontrollable aspects, such as relationships, outcomes, and others' behaviors, becomes more challenging to embrace. For women, the struggle lies in reconciling their emotional resilience and desire for control with Stoic teachings that advocate letting go of desires tied to what cannot be controlled. This tension between reason and emotion creates a nuanced dynamic, as women's heightened attachment to relationships and outcomes often leads to greater emotional distress when those connections are lost or disrupted. While Stoicism offers a path to tranquility through rational detachment, it does not fully account for the complexities of women's lived experiences, particularly their cultural conditioning and emotional investment in relationships. For many women, letting go feels less about rational acceptance and more about the fear of losing an integral part of themselves. Therefore, bridging the gap between Stoic principles and women's emotional nature requires a deeper understanding of how these two approaches interact. Finding a balance between Stoic detachment and the need for emotional connection may allow women to cultivate resilience without sacrificing their emotional well-being. Ultimately, acknowledging the unique challenges women face in applying Stoic teachings can pave the way for a more integrated approach to managing emotions in pursuit of peace.